Thank you for joining us for the Determining Compensatory Education Professional Development. This morning we'll begin with a comparison between compensatory services, recovery services, and extended school year. Then we'll move into the COVID-19 Compensatory Education Plan, including ensuring understanding of the plan, timeline and reporting requirements, outreach, next steps for school teams, roles and responsibilities of staff, the specific criteria used for the determination of compensatory education, prior written notice, documentation and tracking requirements, compensatory education conversations, and then the reimbursement process. We'll end with a scenario activity that includes discussion of collaboration and logistics. First, to ground our thinking as we move through this presentation, we are obligated to provide students with a free, appropriate public education. Students with disabilities are defined as those students who are eligible for an IEP or a Section 504 plan. When FCPS does not provide these students with a free, appropriate public education or a FAPE, compensatory education is an equitable remedy to address that failure. We are required to have the determination of compensatory education occur during an IEP meeting or a Section 504 plan meeting. We have created a guidance document for compensatory education. That guidance document is available in Google, and we will ensure that folks are able to get to that on the hub very shortly. To begin this morning, we will begin with a check and connect, and these are a series of true-false questions. As part of this check and connect, we'll compare and contrast the differences between compensatory education, recovery, and extended school year. True or false? A student may be eligible for compensatory education services, recovery services, and ESY. This is true. Students may receive extended school year services as determined by the IEP team. That determination is made annually. They may have received recovery services during the pandemic period, and this new determination that is required may lead to the provision of compensatory services as well. True or false? ESY services may be used as a way to deliver compensatory education services. This is false. At this time, we will not be utilizing ESY services to provide compensatory education services, particularly during the summer. ESY services are determined annually and are determined in order to ensure that students do not lose progress during long breaks. And there are specific criteria in place for the determination of ESY services. This is a separate conversation. True or false? Compensatory education may still be owed to a student who has already received recovery services. This is true. The criteria used for the determination of recovery services and the criteria used for the determination of compensatory services are different. Students may have already qualified for and received recovery services, and all teams are required to consider compensatory services as a separate conversation utilizing the criteria outlined in this training this spring. This comparison chart is included in the guidance document and goes into more detail regarding the differences between compensatory services, recovery services, and ESY. Next, we'll talk about the COVID-19 Compensatory Education Plan. The outcomes of this plan and this conversation are listed on your screen. Next slide. The core understandings of the plan are important for staff to know because all staff have an obligation for the implementation of the plan. Staff who have responsibilities for Section 504 implementation and delivery, as well as staff who have responsibility under the IDEA. The basics of this plan are that we must reach out to the current parents, guardians, and adult students in FCPS who have disabilities. We must reach out to students who have to the parents, guardians, or adult students who have either graduated or left FCPS. These are folks with students with disabilities. For students who are currently enrolled, we must have IEPs or 504 meetings for those students to consider compensatory education. For students who have left or have graduated, those IEPs or 504 meetings will be held upon request. The final requirement of this plan, which is publicly available on the FCPS homepage, is ongoing monitoring of the progress towards the determination of compensatory education services, as well as the delivery of any services that are determined by those teams. Next, we'll talk about staff roles and responsibilities in this. In your guidance document, there is a roles and responsibilities chart where you can see the responsibilities of school administrators, special education department chairs, 504 school-based coordinators, and then case managers of both IEPs and 504s, the responsibilities of school staff members, including general education staff, related service providers, and any other staff members who may have these responsibilities. It also includes the responsibilities of central office staff and the FCPS plan administrator, which is a requirement under the plan for compensatory education. You'll notice that the school administrator has responsibilities to collaborate with other schools and central office staff, participate and support staffings prior to meetings, facilitate and lead these meetings as needed, develop an internal school process to ensure that all these meetings are held as required and that these determinations are made. They're also responsible for assisting with the importing of the information that is determined for students into the tracking system, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Special education and Section 504 staff members have responsibilities to schedule these meetings and gather and review this data, in addition to the same responsibilities that the school administrators have. School staff also shares a responsibility for assisting with scheduling these meetings as needed, gathering and reviewing the data, and participating in these meetings, and potentially completing and sending the prior written notice, depending on the staff member's responsibility area. Central office staff has a different set of responsibilities. We have provided the initial outreach to parents and guardians and adult students of both currently enrolled and formerly enrolled students. We also have a responsibility to participate and support staffings prior to meetings as needed. Additionally, central office staff will be providing guidance and support for individual cases, processing any parent reimbursement requests, reporting this information to the Office for Civil Rights, and overseeing the implementation of the resolution agreement and the plan. The plan requires that FCPS appoint a plan administrator. As of January 20th, 2023, that position is advertised, and we hope that it will be filled within the next few weeks. The plan administrator has additional responsibilities for assisting schools with developing processes and monitoring the ongoing implementation of the plan. Let's talk next about timelines and reporting. Training for staff began on January 9th with professional development provided to special education department chairs, school-based coordinators, and school-based administrators. That was provided in 2 sessions via the special education department chair meeting. Per the agreement, FCPS is also required to hold public meetings to share this information. 3 public meetings have been held, and another public meeting is scheduled for January 25th. Those meetings are listed on the FCPS homepage and are available via Zoom. January 10th through the 26th, it is expected that school-based turnaround training on this process for determining and documenting compensatory education is occurring. And this is to occur for staff who will participate in compensatory education meetings. The list of those staff members is something we'll go over next. The week of January 9th, FCPS Central Office did contact all parents, guardians, and adult students regarding IEP and 504 meetings to consider compensatory education. That contact included the process for determining compensatory education, as well as the process for requesting reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses that occurred during the pandemic period. On January 26th, there is also an optional professional development, 3 sessions throughout the day on the process for determining and documenting compensatory education. That professional development is a repeat of this professional development, but it is live so that staff may participate in real time in the training. February 1st through June 16th is the time frame for IEP and 504 plan meetings to be held. If staff is trained ahead of February 1st, they may begin holding these meetings, but the expectation is that all staff will be trained by February 1st and will begin holding these meetings. Compensatory education may be delivered beginning February 2nd and beyond. On February 13th, during a regularly scheduled special education department chair meeting, we will be providing training regarding the process for tracking and documenting and monitoring compensatory education determinations and services for school-based leaders, including special education department chairs and school-based coordinators, as well as administrators. The expectation is that February 14th through the 28th, turnaround training will occur for school-based staff on this process. That turnaround training is for a smaller number of staff because it is only for staff who will be responsible for inputting this data into the tracking system. Staff training is next. The requirement per the agreement, excuse me, with OCR is that within 75 school days of OCR's approval of the training materials, FCPS will provide written guidance and/or training regarding the plan and the criteria for determining compensatory services, as well as the data tracking process, to all relevant division level and school level staff who have responsibilities under Section 504 and Title II. So what does this mean? The following folks must receive and document receipt of this training. This includes school-based administrators, Section 504 coordinators, those are typically called SBCs, special education department chairs, special education teachers and case managers, Section 504 case managers, related service providers, including clinical staff and ETRs, specific and specified central office staff who may attend IEP or 504 meetings or consult with teams, and then general education teachers, counselors, and any other staff who may attend these meetings, be involved in these decisions regarding compensatory education. This means that this professional development must be shared widely with school staff. Next, we'll talk about the determination of compensatory education. Next steps for school teams include the following. Identifying the students who need 504 or IEP meetings to consider compensatory education. Scheduling those meetings. Gathering and reviewing student data per the worksheet that we'll share with you in a few minutes. Holding any staffings that are needed. Holding meetings to make those determinations per IEP and 504 processes. Documenting those decisions on a prior written notice and providing that prior written notice to the parent or guardian or adult student. And then providing compensatory education to those students whose IEP team or 504 team determine that they require it. A note that we are developing a tracking system for this, and that tracking system training will occur on February 13th as part of the Special Education Department Chair meeting. A CSTARS report has been developed to show this information. That report does include the names of students who were attending FCPS during the pandemic period, which is identified as April 14th, 2020 through June 10th, 2022. It also includes students who are enrolled, or have withdrawn or graduated from our system, because we do have an obligation to hold meetings for those students should their parents request it. Next, we'll take a peek at what that report looks like. Please note that the report that you see on your screen, can we make it just a little bit bigger? The report that you see on your screen does not contain real student data. Note that it includes the student's enrolled school, the student's ID number, grade, name, whether they have an IEP or a 504 plan, their date of birth, any corresponding language information, their base school. It also includes the student's enrollment history. Where were they during this time frame? And importantly, it includes parent and guardian information, including each parent's name, email address, mailing address, and whether they have educational rights and are allowed contact with the student, and any phone numbers that we may have listed for the student. Again, this is not real information, and so the information that is on your screen is not complete. Finally, in the far right column, the report includes the status of compensatory services for the student. That will include the words not started, in progress, or complete to indicate where the student is in the process. Students are organized in this report by whether they are currently enrolled, whether they have graduated, or whether they have withdrawn from the system. This report can be run in C-STARS by clicking on the 3 horizontal lines in the upper left corner and opening the menu. And at the very bottom of that menu is the compensatory services menu. Students can be looked at by student, by scrolling through or searching for specific students, or by running this report. Additional information on this is being developed right now, but if you are a current C-STARS user, this functionality should be fairly familiar to you. Let's talk about the process and the criteria for the determination of compensatory services. Per the agreement with the Office for Civil Rights, FCPS did develop a plan that is outlined both on the FCPS public website as well as, as well as in the guidance document that you will have access to. As I said a few minutes ago, the pandemic period is identified as April 14th, 2020 through June 10th, 2022. One question that we have received as we have shared this information with staff and the public is, why are we including such a large time frame? The pandemic period is broken down essentially into 3 time periods. The first period is the shutdown that occurred in the spring of 2020, when students did not attend school from mid-March through the end of the year. Schools were closed. If you recall, students were provided with some instruction during that time period, but it was not anywhere near the instruction that they would have received if they were in school in person. We also moved, because of that, we moved to utilizing temporary learning plans for students, and some related services could not be provided during that time period. During the fall of 2020 and throughout the 2020-21 school year, students received a combination of virtual instruction and remote learning, as well as in-person learning. Students were returned to school during that school year in cohorts and groups. Additionally, we had a 4-day school week, with Mondays being reserved for intervention. Because of the interruptions during that year is included in the pandemic period. The 2021-22 school year is also included as part of the pandemic period, because during that school year, we had significant pauses in students' instruction. Per the CDC requirements, students who were close contacts with people who had COVID-19 were paused for 10 days at a time. Therefore, many students were significantly impacted during last school year by pauses in their instruction due to COVID-19. Additionally, many students also had COVID-19, or the staff members that taught them were out for significant periods of time. So the pandemic period is well defined, and we know that compensatory education is special education or related services that are provided to a student to remedy educational deficits that resulted from the failure or inability of the school division to provide those services during the pandemic. The criteria for determining the provision of FAPE and compensatory education is listed on the guidance document, and we will go through that as well. The next slide, the guidance document is there for you, but the next slide also includes language from that. So the first question that teams must answer is, did FCPS fail to provide the student with the services required by the student's 504 plan or IEP that was in effect at the beginning of March 2020? As part of that conversation, the team will consider whether the student received the amount and type of the service that was required by the student's IEP or 504 plan. And we must note that services provided by parents or guardians during the pandemic period are not counted as services provided by FCPS that were required by existing IEPs or 504 plans. What does that mean? That means that if a student had a specific service listed on their IEP or 504 plan at the beginning of the or any time during the pandemic period, and it was not provided by the school division, but it was provided by the parent, as we consider compensatory services, we cannot consider any services that were provided by the parent as having been provided by the school division. So, for example, if a student had speech language services on their IEP at the beginning of the pandemic period and did not receive speech language services from the school division during the spring of 2020, but the parent paid privately for those services, we would still be considering compensatory services for the spring of 2020 because FCPS did not provide those services. The next question that teams must answer is, were changes made to the IEP or 504 plan during the pandemic period, whether that's temporary learning plans or virtual IEPs or some other remote learning plan, or that the plan could not be implemented, where changes resulted in lesser services provided to the student than the IEP or 504 plan had prior to the changes. For students with IEPs specifically, the question must be answered whether progress on goals was impacted by remote learning. So for this determination to be made, teams must consider the following: the student's current present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, the student's previous rate of progress toward their IEP goals in the pre-pandemic period, and then the documented frequency and duration of any services that were provided to the student prior to the service disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Essentially, we are looking at What should the student have received? What did the student receive? And what is the impact of what the student received or did not receive? We will be asking you to look at data sources, pre-pandemic period, during the pandemic period, and post-pandemic period. We will jump to look at this chart in its entirety in order to have this conversation. Thank you. It's a little bit hard to see at regular resolution. So school teams will be looking at the pre-pandemic period, which is prior to March of 2020, to establish a baseline. They're going to be looking at rate of progress, any observations or data that may have occurred from anyone who knows the student, including parents, therapists, teachers, or other folks who had direct contact or have direct contact with the student. Additionally, the team will be looking at any information that's maintained on the student. That may include screening data, evaluations, assessments, pre-tests, post-tests, anything that was maintained has been maintained since that time period. Additionally, any other curriculum-based assessments or other data items will be considered. And any other relevant factors, including, students' attendance or anything else that may be there. And again, the guiding questions here are, did the student make progress prior to the school's closing? And what were the students' baseline measures on their IEP prior to that pandemic period? During the pandemic period, there should be data, and that data should be reviewed. The questions here are, did the student receive the type or the amount or type of services during the pandemic period, as was indicated on any IEP or 504 plan that was in effect prior to April of 2020? In this context, the word services is a much broader word and a broader term than we typically would use. Services here refers back to the Section 504 legal language that includes services such as accommodations, supplementary aids, evaluations, anything that allows the student to access their education. So when we talk about services here, it's a much broader term. The next question, again, is whether changes were made. What happened with the student's education? The worksheet that we'll look at in a few minutes talks about and guides teams through this conversation as they gather and review this data. What did the student receive during the pandemic period? Again, the conversation is, what should they have received? What did they receive? And what was the impact of what they received? The team will consider the student's attendance during the pandemic period. Were they able to access instruction in order to receive what was available to them? And then again, what was the impact? How was the student's performance and progress impacted by not receiving what they should have received? And then we'll look at the current time frame. Where's the student now? What is happening with the student? For students who may have graduated and parents are requesting, or adult students are requesting that these meetings are occurring, this is an important conversation. It is important to ask, do you have current information regarding progress in college, or for students who may be more impacted in not going to college, are you able to hold a job? Are you impacted by reduced post-secondary skills and training during the pandemic period? What is happening for the student now? And then the team will make an individualized determination regarding what that student may need in order to return that student to the position that that student would be in if that student had received the services that would meet his or her individual needs. The team will also state and document the factors considered in determining the compensatory education. The team will also develop and document their plan for the delivery of timely compensatory education to the student should it be warranted. And then finally, the team will utilize C-STARS to document the outcome and complete a prior written notice regarding the outcome. To clarify, in this situation, prior written notices are required for students with 504 plans. Additional professional development has been provided and is being provided regarding writing prior written notices, because we understand that folks who typically are 504 case managers do not write prior written notices. So we are providing some additional training on this. Next, we'll look at the student decision worksheet. And we'll just stay right here in this. So this decision worksheet should be attached to the 504 plan or to the IEP. It's going to ask the team to talk about the present level of performance and include any data sources that are being used, any mitigating interventions or services that were provided. Did the student receive recovery services? Did the student already receive some compensatory services? Did the student receive significant Monday interventions during the 2020-21 school year? What has occurred for this student? The next part of the worksheet asks the team to look at what did the student have. For students on IEPs, this is an easy, not easy, but this is a simple worksheet to complete. What were the services? Were there any delays in evaluations or eligibility? Were there any related services? Was there paused instruction? For students with 504 plans, you'll be looking at the student's eligibility document as well as the top of the 504 plan to look at the area impacted. There were delays as well for students who became eligible for 504. Some students on 504s do have related services, and so if they had those, they would be indicated here. What was the student's ability to access instruction? What was the student's attendance like? Looking at that information is really important. When did the student return to learn? When did they come back during the 2020-21 school year? We are working with IT to get that information to you in an easy way. We're also working to develop a document that includes loosely the information regarding when students returned during the 2020-21 school year. We're just waiting for a few more pieces of information, and we'll publish that document. When did the student receive targeted instruction, or did they? Did they come in on Mondays? Did they have intervention block? Did they attend SOAR at the elementary level? Did they have any other interventions in place? Did the student receive recovery services? What areas did those recovery services address? When was it provided? And did it help? The next page of the worksheet looks at the comparison of the IEPs or 504 plans. What was in place? What kind of TLP? Was there a change? This page mostly applies to IEPs, but there, as I said a few moments ago, some students on 504 plans did have actual services such as OT or speech. When did the student return? Was there a difference? Were there any changes to the IEP or 504 plan? And it really breaks down each time period during the pandemic period to look at any changes that may have occurred for students. And then at the bottom, you'll be asked to enter your plan for compensatory education, should it be required. If compensatory education is required for the student, it's important to look at and to document here, how will you provide services? If it is not required based on this discussion and this review of all of this information, then you may say something like, compensatory education is not required for the student because. We want to be able to justify the decision that is made by the committee. We'll look briefly right now at the documentation of this in C-STARS while we're here in this document. The IEP services page in C-STARS has been updated to include C19 comp services as an option. And then at the bottom of that screen, there's a spot where you do need to say, does the student require compensatory services? Yes or no? And then document the decision, how those services will be delivered if they're determined, and then an outline of the plan for the delivery of those services. If the committee determines that compensatory services are required for the student, but no provider has been identified yet, you would say services will be provided once a provider has been identified, to indicate that we are looking for a provider. Parents may have a provider. We are also looking at outside providers, and we are putting together a system to gather staff information for those who are interested in providing compensatory services. Excuse me. Compensatory services will be listed along with all other services. On the 504 plan, there is new functionality. So if services, there is new functionality to allow for the inclusion of services in the 504 plan. If services are indicated for compensatory services, you would check the include services in 504 plan box and then answer the question, does the student require compensatory services? And then document how those services will be delivered. You would save, and then on the services page of the 504, you can indicate the compensatory services that are determined by the team. Those services will be listed, and then you also can indicate and should indicate specifically how those services will be delivered. We can jump back to the PowerPoint slideshow now, and we will be looking at how these discussions occur during IEP meetings and 504 plan meetings. And to ground our work just a little bit, we know that this is a heavy lift for schools. In looking at our data, we found that the vast majority of IEPs occur during the spring. That coincides with the requirement to hold these meetings by the end of the school year. So we can go to the next slide. We would be including these conversations during the annual IEP process. It may require that the team meet a little bit longer, but these conversations can occur during that typical process. For students who have already had their annual IEP meeting, it may make sense to hold an addendum meeting in order to have this specific item considered for students. For students who may have IEP due dates in the summer or early fall of 23, it may make sense to reset the student's annual IEP due date and just move it up to occur during the springtime. That is really a decision that should be made by the case manager in consultation with the department chair to determine when and what kind of meeting to hold. As with every IEP, there is still the requirement that a prior written notice be completed. We talked specifically about how to document compensatory services on the IEP. And just a reminder, compensatory education will be documented in two places, on the services page as well as the prior written notice. The plot page is used to state the purpose of the meeting. For example, January 20th, 2023, the IEP team is convening to complete an annual IEP for Dawn and to determine if compensatory education services are required. And that would be the statement on the plot page. We can look next at 504s. 504s do not have addendums as a concept. It really is just an annual meeting or a meeting. In looking at our data, 504 plans, many of them have their annual review date in the fall. So it may make sense to move that annual review date up to the spring, or it may make sense to just hold another meeting. The requirement, though, is that a prior written notice be completed at the conclusion of each 504 plan meeting. If you have questions or concerns specifically about students with 504 plans on your caseload and whether to move the annual review date up or to hold an additional meeting, work with your school-based coordinator and or administrator to make that determination. We previewed the functionality, and as a reminder, the determination of compensatory services will be included on the services page, as well as on the prior written notice for the 504 plan. Again, we recognize that this is new functionality for staff who complete 504 plans, and we are in the process of providing additional training to 504 case managers and SBCs on this new functionality. As we've stated a few times, prior written notice is required for both IEPs and 504 plans. The prior written notice is the same for both. It includes the same components and references the procedural safeguards for each type of PWN. In the first box of the PWN, that is what we call the WHAT box, W-H-A-T. What did the committee propose? or what did the committee refuse? And list those items there. The next box is the reason for the proposal or the refusal, what we call the why box, WHY. Why was that chosen? It's going to include an explanation. The team determined this because of this. The why box always includes because, or some phrase that is the same as because. In the next box, we're looking at other options considered and rejected. So the team considered something and rejected it because, so we always want to include that. If no other options were considered, the prior written notice will need to indicate that. The next box is your data box. What did you use? What did you consider? What data sources led to the decision that was made? They must be listed. And then the last box is the other relevant factors. What else plays into the decision? For students who have graduated, that is certainly a factor that would need to be considered. For students who do not attend FCPS any longer, that would need to be considered. And any other relevant factors that come up during the discussion at the table. Each prior written notice has text built in regarding the procedural safeguards. The procedural safeguards that happen to be on the screen right now are the ones for special education, but the 504 PWN does reference the 504 procedural safeguards as well. Next, we're going to talk about the reimbursement process that is in place. It is a little bit different, and so we are going to go through that. So, parents who are seeking reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses that for items or things that they provided to their child do need to submit invoices or receipts or any other documentation to the student's case manager so that the team may consider it. The team will first consider compensatory education. Then the team will consider any requests for reimbursement of out-of-pocket expenses. If the team determines that reimbursement is warranted, and the way that we'll know that it's warranted is if that service was indicated in the student's IEP or 504 plan during the pandemic period, and it was not provided by the school division, but it was provided by the parent, then reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses for that item is warranted. If the team determines that reimbursement is needed, the case manager will need to email the plan administrator, copy the parent, and let the plan administrator know what the team decided, what is being reimbursed, and the amount. The case manager will also need to attach any receipts or invoices and the completed worksheet showing the payment. Then the plan administrator will follow up with the parent to obtain an IRS W-9 and any other needed documentation. Per FCPS regulation, we are required to obtain a W-9 in order to reimburse a parent because we must establish the parent as a vendor in our system. It typically takes about 45 calendar days for reimbursement to occur, which includes setting the parent up as a vendor in our system and the processing of payment and issuing of the check. There is a reimbursement worksheet included in the guidance document to help the team have this conversation. So the first thing that the team would look at is what is the parent requesting to be reimbursed and the amount for the reimbursement. As many reimbursement worksheets as needed may be attached to the IEP or 504 plan. The next question is, was the service that the parent provided indicated in the student's plan? Was the service provided by the parent due to FCPS's failure to provide the service? How did this service assist the student? Review any data that you have. And then the last question is, has the case manager received these receipts or invoices? And then document the team's determination. That determination will also need to be documented on the services page in the text box on the IEP or the 504 plan. Next up, we'll look at some student scenarios that you may encounter. The first scenario is an elementary scenario where the student is a fifth grader in an ID program. He receives 20 hours of self-contained special education, with 10 hours of that, or an additional 10 hours, in general education for morning meeting, lunch, recess, specials, and focus lessons for science and social studies. Although the student spends the majority of his day in the special ed setting, his hours have increased from 6 to 10 to access more time in the gen ed settings. And what steps might we take? The first thing would be to look at the student's data using the worksheet. We would be looking at what his IEP looked like prior to the pandemic. We would be looking at any TLPs or any virtual IEPs. We would be looking at when the student returned to in-person learning. We would be looking at any pauses that the student may have had. We would be looking at whether the student received recovery services. We would be looking at what kinds of interventions the student received. We might also look at whether the student attended ESY or any other programming put on by the school. And most importantly, we would look at the student's progress. Is the student making sufficient progress? Are they showing that they are progressing in their learning and on their IEP now versus prior to the pandemic? What does that look like for the student? Again, we're looking at the impact of the COVID pandemic and the services that were or were not provided on the student's progress. We'll look at the next scenario, which is the high school scenario. This is a student who graduated. He had a 3.1 GPA and he had an advanced studies diploma. When he was in school with FCPS, he received 15 hours a month of LD services in the gen ed setting, and his need was in the area of reading. Those services took place in his English class. He attended NOVA for a year and then he transferred to JMU. Importantly, we must consider what we would do for a student who has graduated from high school. This would apply to students with IEPs as well as students who had 504 plans. It's important to consider what occurred for that student during the pandemic period. When were they in school? When were they not in school? What kind of plans, whether it's an IEP, a 504 plan, a TLP, or a virtual IEP, what kinds of plans were in place for the student? What kind of services or accommodations or any other items required for the student were able to be implemented or not for the student? We know many students with 504 plans could not receive accommodations that were indicated in their 504 plans because of virtual instruction. What was the impact of that? We've received word from many parents of graduates who say My students' experience with virtual instruction continues to impact them in college. It's important to look at what the current impact is for the student in their current setting, whether that's college, a four-year university, community college, or the workplace. What is the current impact of the COVID pandemic on that student? The next scenario is another elementary scenario, and this is a student who has a specific learning disability, and she receives services across the general education and the special education setting. She accesses OG for reading and connecting math concepts for math instruction. When she returned to school, the team considered recovery services, and she received them during the summer for a total of 60 hours. Her parents are still concerned that she's not reading on grade level. So for this student, the team again would look at what was in place prior to the pandemic, what services were in place during the pandemic period, including recovery services. And the team would look at the student's progress. Importantly for this student is the concern that she still is not reading on grade level. It would be really important to look at her rate of progress prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and in the post-pandemic period during this current school year in order to determine whether she requires compensatory services. If she does, the team would need to consider what exactly is required, since she does have impact in both reading and math, and how those services will be delivered. We, as I said earlier, we are currently looking at developing a way for FCPS staff who wish to provide recovery services can do so through central office. So we are creating a central repository of staff. We're also looking at outside vendors, but we do ask that you look inside your building first, and then at your pyramid, your region, and then central office for assistance with how to provide these services. The next scenario is a high school scenario for a student with some more significant impacts. Alice is 23 years old and graduated in June of 21 with an applied studies diploma. When she was with FCPS, she received 30 hours a week of services in a special education setting and received instruction in the aligned curriculum. She's currently living in a group home with minimal job experience. For Alice as a graduate, it's important to look at what Alice received pre-pandemic, during the pandemic period, and then where she is now. We know that many students who required job skills experience and training during the pandemic did not receive it to the extent that they perhaps should have. The team would need to consider what could provide Alice the team would need to consider whether Alice first requires compensatory services based on the data, and if so, what might assist Alice as a young adult with the level of functioning that she has in order to provide her with the skills that she still needs. We are working with outside agencies at the moment to gather and determine what might be available at FCPS expense for students like Alice. Additional information will be shared with ETRs at the high schools so that this conversation can occur and that services can be determined as needed for students in Alice's situation. Stay tuned for additional information on this. The important thing to note for Alice and for all students is that these conversations are individual conversations. It's not about what program the student can fit into. It's about what that student requires in order to return that student to the position they would be in if they had received the services they should have received during the pandemic period. Next slide. Ava is an elementary school student. She was in the PAC program for a couple of years, and she's currently in an enhanced autism program. She does go to general education for morning meeting, lunch, and recess. But her parents believe that she could have been more prepared to access more general education if it weren't for the pandemic. Again, just like the other scenarios that we've looked at, we look at what was in place for Ava prior to the pandemic, what occurred for Ava during the pandemic period, and each pandemic period is going to be very important. We know that students in preschool did not fare particularly well with online instruction, and their services were significantly reduced in the spring of 2020. We also know that students who were in the PAC program returned to school. They were one of the first groups to return to school in person in the fall of 20. And we also know that remote learning for any pauses or anything else would have had an impact on students who were situated like Ava. And so the team is going to need to look at all of those pieces. Teams are strongly encouraged to utilize the worksheet provided in order to gather and document the data that is available for students. It's really about what should have been provided to the student, what was provided to the student, and the impact of what was or was not provided to the student on their progress. And so the conversation during the IEP meeting will really focus on those items. The worksheet that is provided will support that conversation. Will is a 7th grader. He is one of those students who's of an age where he would have experienced the pandemic period in another school. He would have been elementary age during that time frame. He's eligible under OHI and has ADHD, and he has speech language as a related service. His current services are 15 hours a month in the special education setting. He is in a Strategies for Success class. He receives 30 hours a month in the general ed setting for English and social studies. And he also receives 2 hours a month of speech language services in a special education setting. For Will, and for any students who may have transitioned during or after the pandemic period, it may be necessary to reach back to the student's case manager from elementary school or the previous school to check to see if there's any additional information they may have that's not in C-STARS. I encourage case managers to look at the historical documents tab for each process inside of C-STARS. That would be where any additional documents would be uploaded for each one of those processes. It's important for all students, but particularly for students who may have transitioned schools during the pandemic period. It's important to look at progress reports for IEPs and grades as a data point. And if necessary, the current case manager may want to consult with the previous case manager, if possible, to obtain any additional information. It will be important in all cases, but extra important in these cases, like wills, to hear the parents' experience and any information that the parents may have regarding what occurred for that student, because they would have spanned a couple of schools potentially. We have two more scenarios. Scenario 7 is another elementary age student. Ryan is a third grader with an emotional disability. He receives self-contained services for ED for 29 and a half hours a week, and then he has counseling for 2 hours a month. He has goals in the areas of behavior improvements and emotional regulation. He had a BIP in place when schools closed. And then since returning to in-person instruction, he has struggled with emotional regulation as well as progress towards IEP goals and his BIP. Like many students who were similarly situated, his attendance during the pandemic period was inconsistent and his BIP was suspended. So for Ryan, again, like all other students that we've talked about, it's really important to look at what was in place for the student prior to the pandemic in terms of his or her IEP or 504 plan and how they were doing during that time frame in school. What happened for that student during each portion of the pandemic period, and what was the impact of what happened for each student? And then we look at what's going on right now for this student. Has the student essentially returned to the position they would be in if they had received all the services that they had on their plan? So it's really important for this student and all students to look at all the data that's available. And for a student like Ryan, it will be key to look at the impact of the BIP being suspended during virtual instruction. Did he engage? Did he attend? What was his behavior during online learning like? And what was the impact of that? Our last scenario is another high schooler. Alex is an 11th grader, and Alex receives 90 hours a month of LD services in the general ed setting. Alex's parents hired a tutor to support his math, reading, and writing, and they are seeking reimbursement. So in cases where parents are seeking reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses, the team will first consider compensatory education and follow the worksheet that's provided for that to make that determination. Then the team will consider reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses and utilize the reimbursement worksheet for that determination. It's important for these determinations to be made that we have the information from the parent, and the invoice or receipt or documentation contains who provided the service, what was provided, when it was provided, what the cost was, and that the parent had paid that cost. It is not going to be acceptable to receive just perhaps an Excel worksheet with costs outlined. We will need actual canceled checks or perhaps even printouts from Venmo or PayPal or something like that would indicate what was paid and to whom. But it's important to keep in mind that the conversation regarding compensatory education occurs first, and then the conversation regarding reimbursement occurs second. If you are in a situation where a parent is requesting reimbursement for placement in private school, you must alert your department chair, and we are requiring that a staff member from the Office of Special Education Procedural Support attend that meeting with you to assist with that conversation. There are additional procedures in place when that is the conversation to be had. If you have a parent who is requesting reimbursement, such as in Alex's situation, please consult with your special education department chair or your school-based coordinator for assistance with that conversation. It would require that you have some additional support during that meeting. We recognize that school teams are not used to having this conversation, but this conversation does need to occur during the 504 meeting or during the IEP meeting, and we will provide additional assistance as needed for that conversation. Additional resources are available. We have the compensatory education plan that's on the website, the guidance document that will be posted shortly. The guidance document does include the comparison chart, the plan, the worksheets. We also have the worksheets available in Google that can be downloaded for you. We are currently building the hub page, and we are looking at what pieces to include there. As soon as the hub page is up and running, we will let folks know, and it will contain many resources for you. Additionally, there is an FAQ available, and we are also going to be posting the FAQ publicly very, very shortly for anyone to access. If you have questions, please email OCR 2022 resolution at fcps.edu. You may also contact me directly at dawn.schaefer@fcps.edu, dawn.schaefer@fcps.edu. Thank you so much for engaging in this professional development. You will receive credit in my PDE for your participation today. Should you have any questions, again, email the email address on your screen. You may also contact your department chair or your school-based coordinator for assistance, or you may email me directly. Thank you so much and have a great day.